Nearly 40% of Arizona's water comes from the Colorado River, but that could drastically change in coming years. What happens next is a key question for the Central Arizona Water Conservation District, and a key question driving its November 5th election. Voters will choose 5 board members to help oversee the Central Arizona Project, which transports Colorado River water to cities and tribes across Metro Phoenix. The Arizona Republic met with all 6 candidates to discuss this important moment for the Colorado River and our taps. Well, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I am so excited to see you. I'm Joanna Allhands. I'm Digital Opinions Editor for the Arizona Republic. And while we are at ASU tonight, and this is a lovely space, this forum is put on entirely by the Arizona Republic. So we are happy to have you. We are the sole presenter of this forum, and me, Joanna Allhands, I write opinions about water issues in our state, and I'm going to be your moderator this evening. So let's talk about why we're here and what's at stake. Down ballot races are often more impactful on our daily lives than those at the top, and especially this one, since the Central Arizona Project delivers Colorado River water to tribes and many of our homes and businesses. But the CAP and the Colorado River are facing what could be a significant turning point in the next couple of years. The Central Arizona Water Conservation District, which oversees the CAP, is almost certainly facing some big decisions to make to ensure that our water continues to flow to our taps. So there are 5 seats open and 6 candidates in this race, and they are all here tonight to talk about their vision and to answer your questions. Welcome, you guys. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
So, and this is an informal chat. We are not doing timed responses or rebuttals tonight because we want to dig into the issues, and they're complex, so we want some time to do that. We do want to make sure that everyone's getting time to respond, and so that's my role, to keep the conversation moving and define things a bit, just in case we need some audience understanding. All the acronyms, there's many. So let's introduce the candidates, and we'll get right to it. So to my left on the end there, we have Lisa Atkins, who has been on the board since 2003. Then we have Brian Biesmeyer, who recently retired, director of Scottsdale's Water Department. We have Rudy Fisher, who lives in Scottsdale and served on a city council and water board in California. And then to my right, we have Terry Goddard, the board president, who served for a time in the early 2000s, and now you've been there since 2018. And Heather Macri, who has been on the board since 2012. And April Pinger-Tornquist, who was elected to the board in 2018. So let's get into the questions, shall we? So we'll just kind of go down the row here, and I want to make sure that we have time for all of you. And so we'll just start with a super easy one, which is, why are you running? This is a 6-year term, and it's unpaid. So something must have attracted you to this work, or for the incumbents to keep you doing it. So tell us a little bit about why. Lisa, you get to start. I know you're excited about starting.
I am thrilled.
She always gets to start. It's not fair.
That's what happens when your last name starts with A.
I'm telling you, A names.
That's right. Well, my start with the Colorado River was actually on Capitol Hill working for a member of the Arizona congressional delegation. And that was at a time where Arizona was working very, very hard to make sure that we got the authorization appropriation for the building of the dam, of the whole process. So I came at this from a different standpoint, having watched every year Arizona fight very hard to get the authorization appropriation to build the Central Arizona Project. When Congressman Stump retired, there was a vacancy on the board. Governor Hull called and said, there's a vacancy on the CAP board. You've just spent a long time on authorization appropriation for this project, and I'd like you to take that knowledge and run for the board. And I've been on the board ever since that appointment. And when you look at the land and water issues in this state, and how little private property there really is in the state of Arizona upon which to build an economy, let alone all the houses, then you realize how precious that water is and why the investment of the Central Arizona Project was the right thing to do.
Great. Awesome. So Brian, tell us. Yes. Why are you running?
Well, I grew up in southern Arizona and in rural southern Arizona, and growing up living on a well, you quickly understood what the meaning of water is when you don't have that water and you need to look for other sources. I then fast forward, got my degree at the University of Arizona, went into the Army, spent 8 years on active duty and got out, got my master's degree in environmental engineering, and then got into the water industry, which is not really where I planned to be, but seemed the right circle to make, having started out as my dad's favorite utility worker when I was young and fixing things. So I have that history with water, and then I've worked the last 30 years in the water industry, running utilities throughout the state, some private side utilities and then others from the city of Peoria to the city of Scottsdale, and have a deep background in water and a passion for water, and believe I can provide that level of expertise on the board. I note that I think the board should have a broad representation, but I also think there should be somebody on the board that really understands the ins and outs of the water industry, and I'd like to be that person.
Great. Rudy.
Thank you. Well, Joanna, you're right. This is a 6-year commitment for no pay. And I joke with my wife that I've saved my whole life for this job, so I want to take it on. So I'm running because I watched the situation in Arizona and gone to a lot of the CAP meetings over the last 3 years. And 2 years ago, I was supporting somebody who was eventually elected, but people kept asking me why I wasn't running, because I worked on municipal and regional water projects. And this year, several people asked me to run, and so I did. And that's the story. I'm running and looking forward to getting elected onto the board.
Terry.
Thank you. And thanks to you and the Republic for having this get together. This gorgeous arena. I think Walton, once again, is leading the pack. I got, for me too, it was hereditary. I grew up in southern Arizona also, like Brian, where they don't have very much water, but that's true of the whole state. In college, I wrote my thesis on the coming of the Central Arizona Project, and I picked a really good year to do that, 1966-67, which when the critical hearings were being held in Washington. And I got to see firsthand, I mean, this was sort of an amazing opportunity to see the fight going on, led by Morris Udall and John Rhodes, to get authorization for the CAP, which was finally passed in 1968. So from that, I got a clear understanding that the most incredible talents that this state has produced, and I include also Carl Hayden, of course, Stuart Udall, is an amazing group that we had in Washington, and watching them coordinate and the kind of planning and the desperate urgency for getting this program going really wore off on me. I got a tremendous feeling that this is what Arizona needs, because these folks have led the way on getting it to us, and now our mission is to protect it. And that's going to be a strident and difficult program, one that's going to require both experience and influence, such as Lisa has referred to. I mean, knowing what goes on in Washington as well as knowing what goes on in the State House here in Arizona is going to be critically important to defending the CAP and making sure that we don't get cut further. So it's a passion that goes back to my college days.
Heather.
Thank you. And thank you again, everyone, for hosting us tonight. This is wonderful. For me, I actually wanted to be an environmental lawyer, and that's why I went to law school. Unfortunately, I graduated in 2008, and there weren't a ton of jobs to be an environmental lawyer. And I actually started doing bankruptcy work, and in one of my cases, I started appearing before the board. And I was noticing that the canals were in deferred maintenance, people weren't talking about climate change, the energy portfolio was coming from one place. There were just a lot of things that concerned me. And I actually, frankly, complained to my friends and family about it a lot until someone said, well, why don't you run for the board? And I did. I decided to run in 2012, thinking, quite frankly, that I wouldn't win. And that maybe though I would shift the conversation, maybe we would start talking about these things. But I did win, and I've now spent 12 years on the board, and I'm extremely proud of what I've been able to accomplish in those 12 years in terms of transparency, in terms of really expanding our climate change programs, in terms of really, working on some of these really important things like the drought contingency plan. I'm running again. I've been on for 12 years, and I'm running again because there is so much more work to do. And I think that we need people who have the experience, who have been on the board, who understand some of these issues to keep a steady hand at the wheel. But I will also tell you, I think I bring a little bit of a different perspective. I am a lawyer, I have a young child, I work deeply in policy even within what I do as a lawyer. And I do think I bring a little bit of a different perspective, as well as being a person who's absolutely fought and proven herself again and again and being able to make change that's been positive for our Arizona water community. Thank you.
Yeah, April. So about 7 years ago, a friend of mine who was in the water business, and I often had conversations with him, asked me if I would consider running for the CAP board. And to be honest, I really didn't know much about the board at the time. I'm an aerospace mechanical engineer. My husband and I owned a small product development company. And a lot of our work is in flow, liquid and gas flow. So I was fascinated by the large pumps, by these valves that control the canal. But I was also very interested in policy. So just over the months and years of having discussions with my friend, he convinced me that I should run. And the reason that he said I should run, because I don't have any connections to the water industry, is precisely because of that. I have no horse in the race. So, and he knows me to be a principled individual, and he said we need someone in there that will only consider the taxpayers when they're voting. And so I ran for the first time. I didn't expect to win either, and I did. And that was right before the vote on the drought contingency plan. And I was handed a 4-inch thick 3-ring binder to review over a few weeks, put my study skills to the test. And I've been loving it ever since. CAP is a wonderful organization. It's quite honestly run much better than I was expecting for a government organization. And I'm looking forward to serving again. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, awesome. So you're in it to win it. Awesome. This is good. But yeah, we've kind of, some of you mentioned this, that there's sort of some issues we need to talk about with CAP. And I mentioned that there's this turning point we're hitting here pretty soon, because the current rules for operating Lake Mead and Lake Powell expire at the end of 2026. And while there is wide agreement that the next set of rules must do more to stabilize the lakes in coming decades, we've hit a log jam, to say it nicely, over how doing more will play out. So what's at stake for CAP in these negotiations? And I'm totally open. We want to start with Brian and just kind of go this way. Does that sound good? Perfect. Or everybody can just sort of jump in as needed too, so.
Sure. Well, a lot's at stake, obviously. As you've mentioned, our allocation during drought is at stake. The lower basin states have come up with a proposal, but the upper basin states haven't agreed. So if there is more cuts to be put on Arizona, it could be rather difficult for the state to comply with those cuts as they're done. And it's called a Z diagram. I don't want to get too in depth with it, but that's what's called the lower basin state proposal. And there's an intermediate stage where the cuts look like they can be done by the utilities, but the lower part is where the upper basin needs to come to play, and they have not wanted to come to play. So, yeah, we need to be firm on that, and I think the CAP needs to understand what those triggers are for our communities on how much water can we give up and how much can we not? And there's a point where we cannot. That doesn't mean there aren't other things that have to be done. That's not the only thing in discussion. We need more water sources. Obviously, water conservation is part of that. But we also need to defend the turf and understand that there's a limit to how much Arizona can give up on this critical resource. So the next couple of years are going to be critical, and I would just argue that I have an understanding of that. I understand what the utilities need to provide that water to folks, and I think that's going to be critical as we go forward to ensure that that amount of water is there. I also want to make sure that we start getting a lot of that groundwater that we've stored over the years back. We put a lot of groundwater in the ground from CAP, from the CAP system, to retrieve in drought. And as of yet, we don't have a single well out there that's pumping that water out. We need to start that.
Rudy, what's at stake here?
As Brian said, a lot is at stake. And in looking at what the future cuts could be, it's really scary because they can get much, much deeper than what we're dealing with right now. Fortunately, we're able to deal with what we've got. We also have some very smart people in Arizona who are looking at different aspects of how do we get water within Arizona. The Governor's Water Policy Committee is looking at using unused ag water for urban uses. We've got SRP looking at raising one of their dams to to mitigate for some sedimentation where they've lost some capacity, but also to increase capacity. The CAP is looking at doing some interconnects similar to one they did in 1990 with SRP. So a lot of people looking at different aspects of how to take care of ourselves here. But the big solution, I think, is dealing with the federal government, with the upper basin states and the other lower basin states to figure out a fair allocation of water. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we'll be there by 2026. I think the negotiations will go on for some time to come, but I think we need to get there. I think the first 20 years of the CAP were the easy years. We had new infrastructure, the Lake Mead was rising, the canal was flowing, everything was going well. The CAP board was talking about what to do with the surplus. Well, 2020 hit and the drought started. Over time, people realized, the water is going down in Lake Mead. We need to accommodate that. We need to start cutting back. I think at this point, we need to figure out something for the next 20 to 100 years. That's flexible, but that involves all the states, all the resources, and that's equitable among all the resources.
Terry.
Well, we're facing, it's like looking into a cannon because, there are three resolutions. The tradition on the river that started with the Colorado Compact in 1922 was the states were going to fix it. The states were going to work among the 7 basin states and come up with a solution. They came up with the Colorado Compact in 22. Arizona, of course, didn't like it. We didn't sign it until, 44, but the only state that wouldn't. But we've always been a little out of the pack. That's okay. But we ended up having to go to the Supreme Court to finally resolve the question of whether or not the Gila was our water or theirs. Fortunately, the Supreme Court came down on our side. But there are 3 possible ways that this next evolution gets taken care of. The states follow tradition, and we come up with a solution. I think that's the preferred method. The second, and definitely less, and it has to be done by 2026. Congress is going to have to approve it, and in Arizona, the Arizona legislature will have to approve whatever we do as a solution for the 7-state agreement. The second one is the federal government imposes a solution. The Bureau of Reclamation is dancing around that right now. They're asking for input on an environmental impact statement, which would relate to how the water is going to be divided in the next 20 years. And then the last one is we go to court. And I think everybody says that's the least desirable, although many in the upper basin seem to be really moving toward that objective very aggressively. I think it's unfortunate. It could tie up our water for years. The last time we were in the Supreme Court, it took 12 years to get a solution. And so nothing could be worse, in my humble opinion, to Arizona's growth and its economic prosperity than to have a judge somewhere well removed from these issues, trying to say, okay, you get that and you get that. So we got 3 different options. 2 of them are terrible. One of them, hopefully, we're going to be able to resolve. But right now, our relationships with the Upper Basin are terrible. I was raised to hate California, as many Arizonans are, and for good reason. It was all over water because the negotiations to get the CAP involved having to deal with a very, very reluctant California delegation. Now we've been able to do, I think, a miracle, which is to have the lower basin, the 3 lower basin states, including California, have put forward a very mature and I think reasonable proposal for the other states. But the upper basin 4 states are not buying it. And so we did what we thought was impossible in getting California on board with us. And now we've got to get Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico.
Heather.
Thank you. It's a tough situation because Terry is right. There really are essentially 3 options. And I agree, even though I'm a lawyer, I agree that the litigation option is not the best one here. If it took us 12 years to get something to the Supreme Court in the 1960s, I can only imagine what that would take now. So I don't think that's a good option. I would love to see us work something out. I do think it would be helpful if the Bureau didn't necessarily come in and make a plan, but at least provide some contours. That's something that we have been asking for, and we haven't really gotten a lot, but I think that would be helpful. Because sometimes I think the threat of the big stick could be helpful. If the Bureau comes in and sort of sets everything under the compact, I think we're not the only unhappy party. The other difficulty we have is that Central Arizona Project is the junior of the junior priority. Arizona is the junior priority, and we agreed to take an even more junior position at the Central Arizona Project in order to get the project built and funded. So we are negotiating from sort of, unfortunately, the bottom of the pile. I do think the fact that we've been able to, sort of speak with one voice as Arizona has been helpful. I do think bringing California on board has been helpful. And I agree, if you had asked me, would we have a plan with California 5 or 6 years ago, I probably would have laughed.
A year ago.
Well, I think we've had the plan for almost a year. But I still have hope. And the reason is because I think that if nothing else, the PR aspect of this for the Upper Basin, having Lake Powell be so full while the rest of us, which represent a huge percentage of the United States population, and especially California with its huge political power, having those of us starving for water, after being the ones who have given everything up, I think that could look really bad, and that could have a lot of ramifications that the Upper Basin might not be fully thinking through. At the Central Arizona Project, we have been voluntarily leaving 500,000 acre-feet of water in Lake Mead to stabilize the system.
It's about a third.
Yeah, it's a third of our supply, and I will tell you that was a hard decision to make. It was a decision that we made, and it was difficult. It really wiped out Pinal County agriculture, but we did it to bring stability to the system. And we have brought stability to the system. And I think that's what we're negotiating for now. It's stability. It's stability for the next 7 years, the next 20. It's stability in terms of how we're going to operate the river. It's stability in terms of our growth and economy. It's stability in terms of how the entire system runs. So I'm hopeful that even though it looks grim now, that we will come to some kind of resolution, because that will be better than any of the other 2 solutions on the table. I will say too, though, it does mean that Arizona needs to, and we've been doing this, but needs to take more of a deeper pause and really start looking at whether it's augmentation, more effluent recycling. It opens the door to some of those things that I think in the past we've thought of maybe been too expensive or the technology wasn't there. So in some ways, I also think that this could be an opportunity. As dark as it is, there's always the silver lining. I think this could be an incredible opportunity for us to do something different, whether it's, reclaiming some of the water that we've been storing underground, which we actually have been working on pilot project wells on that. But doing some of these things that maybe in the past have either been expensive or we've had our eye on other things, maybe this is the opportunity to look at that as well. So I also don't want to waste this potential opportunity.
April.
It has been my experience that most people don't want to cause harm to other people. And so litigation is, I don't think, the first choice for anyone, but certainly least of all Arizona. we have had many really wonderful opportunities to go visit other water users in not just the lower basin states, but in the upper basin states. We've been to both northern and southern Colorado, and just sitting down, breaking bread, learning about what their needs are, because how they handle water in Colorado is very different than how we handle water here. And then just explaining to them what our needs are. And I think people in general are willing to come to the table and discuss. So I think if we continue these opportunities of negotiation, we can avoid the litigation path. Not that I have anything against lawyers.
Just partial engineer.
But that just it's not an ideal path. So I'm looking forward to continue negotiating. Thank you.
Lisa.
It's not an ideal path, but I think that the board and the organization as a whole have changed how we deal with colleagues in the water business, whether they're in the state, whether they're neighboring states, or in the case, we've gone on a lot of trips and learned probably more than we thought we were going to learn. And we've invited all of them down in the winter, which none of them have said, no, sorry, it's too warm in Arizona for us at that point. So there's an ongoing conversation of our peers in the upper and lower basin that I think is going to be very helpful at the end of the day. I don't foresee us going through the same fights that we did when we had to get this project online, get it done, and move forward, because now you can see what we've done with the water. They know how prudent we've been in managing the river, and how our customers have been equally prudent, and how the dynamics of where Arizona is going in the future as far as agriculture is much smaller today than it was when the project was authorized. Businesses have grown. There's an overall feeling throughout the state that water is a very precious resource, whether you're a CAP customer or not. And that is different than it was in the early days when we were talking about getting the Central Arizona project authorized and appropriated. The fact that our board has gone to visit our colleagues in other parts of the basins, I think has opened a door for conversation. And they're very happy to come here in the winter, in January. Not one of them has turned us down as far as coming here, and they'll be able to see. So having more people understand what the process is, what we've done, how prudent we've been with a resource that we fought for a long time, and the willingness of all of our customers to be that prudent, I think is going to be very educational for everybody. If we have that basic platform to have a discussion, I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to get where we need to go. It may not be very fast, but we're going to get there eventually.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting being in Colorado, which seems to be kind of the epicenter of the dissent, of what's been happening. So it's interesting that some of the folks that are there are at the table and are talking, which is good, but it does seem like there is a breakdown that's happened, that's occurred. And I just to give the audience a little bit more perspective on what it might entail to stabilize Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So basically, and I think everybody sort of said this, that the lower basin states that rely on Lake Mead, which includes Arizona, have put forth this plan that essentially says, we're willing to own the structural deficit, things like evaporation and system losses that have caused Lake Mead to decline over time. But that plan is likely going to entail what amounts to some pretty permanent reductions that are actually pretty big for Arizona. The Gila River Indian community, which receives a significant portion of its water via the CAP, has said it's not on board with that. And they have submitted their own plan that would make cuts on a more proportionate basis. And so the Bureau of Reclamation, which oversees the lakes, is analyzing these and some other proposals including one from the upper basin states that rely on Lake Powell, which essentially says the lower basin should shoulder all the cuts and not us. So where do you think reclamation should land on these ideas? And does that differ from where you think they will land on them?
Of course.
And if you and if I have mischaracterized the way that this has gone, take issue with that too. Tell me I didn't say it quite right, but yeah. Rudy, go ahead.
So it strikes me in some ways that we're kind of back where we were in 1922. I mean, if you remember, the reason there's an upper basin and lower basin is Herbert Hoover came out here, talked to the 7 states, and kind of threw his hands up and said, okay, you guys are in the upper basin, work it out. You guys are in the lower basin, work it out. But the Colorado River Basin, if you look at the river basins around the U.S. and around the world, is actually a pretty small river basin. It's a very precious thing, but it's also a public asset of the United States. And I think all the states within the basin states, the upper and lower, have to realize that and have to realize that they have to share that. We have to work that out. I think the CAP introduced the idea of a whole of basin approach, and I think that's a very good way to go. If you look at what's happening in the upper basin, Lake Powell has recovered a bit from where it was a few years ago. It's about 40% right now. But they have other reservoirs which are at 78%, 84%, 92%. You have to kind of balance those things out. I know that they have reasons that they're doing that, but they have to understand that everybody in the basin state have to share in that. And it's not just here in the U.S. or in the Colorado River Basin. So a few years ago, Egypt and Ethiopia almost went to war over the Greater Ethiopian Dam. And when people pointed out, when the UN agencies pointed out, hey, look, the people on a river have to share the resources. You can't just hog it because it happens to be coming sourced from your area. That kind of helped resolve some of those issues and then the agreements to share. So we have to do the same thing here. It's not going to be easy, and I'm glad that we are working with them and meeting with them. That's really what it takes, is looking people eye to eye and understanding what their pain points are, but you have to make them understand what your pain points are. And Arizona has some major pain points. We've really given up a lot of water, and we are the ones who are taking a disproportionate amount of the pain.
Well, I think there's a simple answer, but the Bureau of Reclamation has refused to go in that direction, and the answer is we need assurances that the Colorado Compact will in fact be enforced. And that includes the 7.5 million acre feet of releases.
Can we talk about for the audience, what is the Colorado Compact?
Well, it's the 7-state agreement that was entered in 1922 that basically divided the basins and said 7.5 million acre feet would be allocated to the upper basin, 7.5 to the lower basin. You guys figure it out. And subsequently, Congress decided to help us out, and they decided that Nevada, which was, nobody lived in Nevada in those days, I guess. They got 300,000 acre feet. Arizona got 2.8. And California, the big dog on the river, got 4.4. And then later in 1944, the agreement was made by international treaty to give Mexico 1.5 million from the same source. The big difference between today and then was, of course, they had some very optimistic projections. It turns out that the year they signed the compact was one of the highest flow years in history. I'm not talking just for media history, I'm talking hundreds of years. And what we're dealing with now is probably a more, let's say, long-term river. And instead of 20 million acre feet, which they thought it would have in 1922, it's closer to 11 and seems to be dropping. So you've got more demand, less water, much warmer conditions during our watershed, which means less runoff. It's a combination of things that mean we have to get along with less. So the Colorado Compact, however, has some language in it that basically says it's the upper basin's responsibility to, every 10 years, release 75 million acre feet. That comes out, basic math, to 7.5 a year. And we're remarkably close to having them fall below, because of some low years, below that 7.5, well, that total of 75 million acre feet. In fact, it will hit in 2026 or 2027, depending on what releases we have. Well, isn't it interesting? And so you ask the question, what should the federal government do? And we're unequivocal. I think all of our board has taken the strong position that, and asked every chance we've gotten with the Bureau to say, are you going to enforce the compact? And there's been very artful dodging. Basically, nobody has given us a strong answer. If they would, I think the Upper Basin would immediately come to the table and say, okay, we need to figure out how to handle those years when 7.5 simply isn't possible because of drought in the basin. But right now, they're not being encouraged to do that, and I think that's a big part of our problem.
Heather.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Terry just said is what I was alluding to, is that we really need the Bureau to give some contours here. Because obviously, if they say, hey, we're going back to the compact, that will force the Upper Basin to the table, or at least I would imagine it would. I think the plan, and again, I am biased here. This is the Lower Basin plan that CAP was a huge part of putting forward and has been pushing.
So it's really good.
I think that's actually a very fair and equitable plan. It does spread the pain between the Upper and Lower Basin. That said, I don't think, when I go into, again, I'm going to talk about my job. When I go into a mediation or an arbitration, I always tell my clients, if we get a good result, it means no one goes home happy. Everyone goes home getting a little less than they thought they should. And I think that is what I think about here. I think that the Bureau, if they're not going to enforce the compact, if they're not going to pick one of the plans, what they can do is sort of create a blended option in which maybe, the pain does need to be spread. I don't think this is something that the entire Lower Basin should be shouldering. To your point, when you were talking about the Lower Basin plan, you mentioned the fact that the Lower Basin is essentially absorbing the structural deficit. I think it's worth defining what that means. Essentially, we have been overdrafting the river significantly by at least 1 million acre feet, if not more, every year for 100 years. And this is before we even start talking about evaporative losses and things like that. So, the Lower Basin plan, and again, I know that I was part of it, I'm not probably unbiased here, but the fact that we've said, hey, this is a structural deficit that we've all partaken in, that we've all essentially created from 1922 forward, we're willing to absorb that. In addition to these cuts that we've already taken, I do think that's a very fair and equitable way of spreading things. But again, I think there's also a place here where the Bureau needs to step in and give us some contours. I really do. And again, you hate to sort of put that power in the Bureau and sort of give that up, but I think it would be helpful to get some positioning from them, especially if they're not going to choose one of the plans on the table. And I do think that the cuts need to be fair and equitable across the board. I also think we need to consider within all of this the health of the river system itself and make sure that when we're making these cuts, we're also leaving, I hate to say, a cut for the river. The Colorado River environment is beautiful. It is absolutely a unique place. It is a huge driver of economics with the recreation there. So I think we also need to consider that as part of the plan. I think that would be a responsible thing to do. And so that's really what I'm looking for. I think it would be helpful if the Bureau would step in. I do think we have a good plan, but even if we just use that as a starting place for something of a blended plan, I think it needs to be balanced. I think it needs to bring stability to the system. We can't just store a bunch of water in Lake Powell while the rest of us down here are starving for water. But again, making sure it's balanced between us, Mexico, as well as the Colorado River environment.
April. So, and the question was, where should reclamation land on these ideas, and where do you think they will?
Well, as Rudy mentioned, we have already given up a lot of water, and we did so willingly. And biased or not, we put forward a very fair plan. We put forward a plan that said, we'll meet you in the middle. We'll actually take a little bit more than our fair share of the cuts, but meet us close to the middle here. And some of the other plans were, no, you take all the cuts, you don't have anything. And that's just that it's not reasonable, it's not logical. I guess it's plausible that we may be backed into a corner. I hope not. I hope we can continue to negotiate. But it's certainly not a case of one party starting the negotiation way over here and one party starting way over here, and you're trying to meet in the middle. We started in the middle. So for us to move that far over is just, it's untenable.
Hence the breakdown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why I think, sorry, I'm going to go ahead. Which is why I think the time and effort that we have spent to get to know our colleagues in the upper and lower basin will be critical to continuing a conversation. This is not something that you want resolved in Washington. This is something that you want resolved in the region. And opening that conversation where we've gone to see what they're doing, most of them, as you can imagine, are looking very forward to coming down to Arizona in the wintertime. And we have something to show them. I know what we have done in the past, whether it's been a policy, whether it's just been whatever it has been, it's been prudent. Arizona has always had to fight for what we have as far as water is concerned. We went all the way to the Supreme Court, but I remember the days on Capitol Hill where we would have a difficult time getting the authorization and appropriation every year for the project. And the more that members outside of this region were able to come out to Arizona and see that we weren't wasting water, that we put water to a good use, that the CAP isn't for everybody in the state. We have other water sources. We're very cautious about how we use our groundwater. There's a prudent approach to water in the state of Arizona. Actually, there is now a prudent approach to water in the entire region. And having the opportunity to go see what they're doing, and I think the trips that we're probably going to see in January and February when it's all snow-packed up north will be another step toward that understanding. The more we can do here and not do on the Hill and not do in court, the better off everybody in the region is going to be.
Brian.
Well, since you asked what I would hope the department,
What
the
should
Bureau
and
would
what
do
will?
would be that they would gently nudge the upper basin states to the negotiation table to, which I agree with Lisa here, to come together, because I believe if the states can get together, it's a better solution than if the federal government comes down and decrees what it will be. But I think the Bureau can do well by pushing the states to that table and doing such. What will happen, I'm not certain, but I guess I'll remain optimistic that they will push the upper basin states to the negotiation table. And I applaud the bringing those states down here, because there's a lot we have done, a lot of recycling, a lot of water conservation that we've done. Most of the valley cities have committed to a basin-wide conservation plans and conservation savings. So we have been in league with our upper basin colleagues and committing to conservation savings. We're also leaders in recycling, and we need to show them that. And so we use every drop that we can. I think that can be very convincing to them. I'm hopeful that's very convincing to them. But again, we need to continue to push on these endeavors as well.
It's interesting how little understanding there seems to be between the various states in the basin on exactly what everybody does in their state. It's amazing that we are all bound by a river, but we somehow don't fully understand how each of us uses that water. Now, I know we're getting close to the end of our forum here, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for audience questions. I have more questions. There's so much more we didn't even get to, but I want to make sure that we have time. So if there are questions, I can come around to you and just raise your hand. I got a mic. All right, I see one.
And the furthest away.
That's okay.
Good evening, Al Burgunder from Phoenix. First of all, thanks for participating in this event tonight. This has been very informative. I'm relatively new to Phoenix. Lived here back in the 80s, but then returned 2 years ago. So this subject is very interesting to me. Last night I was watching an interview with the governor of Colorado, and he was speaking about the growth plans of Colorado in terms of people moving in and things of that nature. A question of mine, and I'm sure the governor of Nevada is feeling the same way. Has there been any effort to model a potential future for the 7 states or whatever in terms of their water needs? It was mentioned tonight that we might be requiring less agricultural water, but clearly we're going to be requiring more urban water over time. So, and obviously that's happening in Nevada, it's happening in Colorado. So has there been kind of a 7-state model put together that says, look, this is what the future is going to probably look like in terms of demand, whether it's agriculture or whether it's urban situations or other requirements? Maybe it's making hydrogen for fuel in the future that's low carbon and so forth that requires a lot of water. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that that's something that really needs to be considered rather than letting everybody just defend their turf. So I'm curious to get your views on that matter. Thank you.
So we'll just let you guys weigh in on audience questions.
This is a good use for engineers. The lawyers have taken a fairly big hit tonight, but we do a lot of modeling. CAP does, Bureau of Reclamation as a division, I guess, that do the modeling. Every single one of the various proposals that we've referred to, some specifically, some obliquely, but there are, maybe at least 10 right now on the table, all of which are going to be modeled over the next 20 years by their experts, and they're good. I mean, we live by the models. For example, the amount of DCP reductions that have to be suffered by mostly Arizona are based on a model projection of what Lake Powell and Lake Mead will be or Lake Mead specifically, will be in the next 2 years. That's a short-term model, but what you're talking about is the 100-year look. That's not necessarily what I've been seeing happening. It's a good idea, but we can give you the big picture. 25% of the total water in the Colorado Basin goes to cities and industry. 75% goes to agriculture. So we get tremendous benefits from ag efficiencies. And that's something CAP's been working on very hard. We've got some fairly innovative technologies that we've been trying to get out in the field to see what could be done. It's a capital intense program, so it's going to have to be paid for, but it's one of the ways we can move water in times of real shortage. Not a model, but certainly a forward-reaching technology that I think has a lot of promise.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You know, we're doing the modeling for sure. It's always hard to know, especially with 100-year models, how accurate they're going to be, right? It's difficult to predict. We are in the driest time since the year 1200, and I don't know if a 100-year model would have necessarily encompassed that. It's also hard to predict what climate change is going to do. We certainly know that it's going to be hotter and drier, but how quickly that's going to accelerate, I think, is still very difficult to predict. So we are doing that modeling, but I also don't want to over-rely on the modeling. I do think, though, that it's smart to start looking more at some growth planning and also thinking about, we have agriculture, but do we think we're going to have less agriculture? What does that mean in terms of water usage? Because, like, for example, another thing that might throw off the modeling is the city of Phoenix, where you live, I do as well, uses the same amount of water that it did 50 years ago. You know, as we've seen this conversion essentially from agricultural lands to more urban areas, and certainly as we see more density and growth, more infill, as we see more water smart appliances. We actually saw a huge dip in water usage, I guess about 25, 30 years ago, when they started bringing out requirements to use water safe and water smart, appliances. So, you know, those are all things to think about too in the model. It's a great idea, but I also never want us to be so bound by it, because we do have some really interesting patterns in water usage. And of course, some of it's a judgment. You know, it's easy to say, oh, well, if we have less agriculture, then we have more water for municipalities, but there has to be a balance too. we need some agriculture to have some food security in the US. So again, it really is a balancing act. I will also say agriculture is a huge part of the fabric and culture of Arizona. So again, I think the modeling is great, and I agree with you that we need to do more long-term modeling. But I always just say, hey, remember, sometimes the modeling doesn't take into account some of these things. And also, we want to make sure that we're balancing our interests and we're not just so stuck with the model or stuck with one idea, because there's a lot of things out there that actually work quite well. But thank you, that was a great question. And I'm sorry, April.
Oh, that's okay. You actually
Now to the engineer.
said one of the things that I was going to say, and that's we use less water now than we did in 1980. And some of that is the move from an agricultural society over to more populated industrial. So we know what a municipality uses, and we know what agriculture uses. So in terms of that modeling, we can predict that as we predict the population growth, the cities and town growth. But the water that's coming in, that's the part that is more difficult to model. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to say that, first of all, modeling's not engineering. Just there, it's a component. But and I think
Engineers do modeling.
Yeah, we do modeling.
Lawyers do not.
But it's a component of it, and it gets. The difficulty is, and they're literally, the Bureau's done tremendous amount of modeling. I know CAP as well. It's that it gets less and less precise as you go out every year, and it starts to become huge imprecision as you get further and further out. Thus, like a 100-year model is extremely hard to even use. Where a 3, 5, 10-year model, things look a little better. And there's a lot of that modeling going on. But when they do that, they have so many unknowns, the pattern gets really wide. And then I think that's where the discussions come to play, where what is the reality of this? And it is a great tool, and one that the Bureau is using, and that I think continues to need to be used, but it is only a tool. And a lot of the innovation that comes through conservation has come rather recently, and those things can be game changers when we talk about how they reduce water consumption, both with agricultural as well as with utilities and in your own household. Because a lot of the innovations have come rather recently, and I think they will continue to come and change those impacts and then change that modeling pattern. But I guess in the overall question, yes, modeling is used, and I encourage it to continue to be used.
I think an answer to the gentleman's question really is the smart use of water. And I think we've learned a lot since the Colorado Compact and water law from 1850s and 1860s. We've learned a lot about how water works. We've learned a lot more what to do with water. A couple of months ago, Brian and I were at the Arizona Water Reuse Conference in Flagstaff, and they talked there about what cities can do to process their wastewater into pure water that can be either injected in the ground or with technology that we now have directly put into the water system. Using abandoned agricultural water in Harquahala that we can use and clean up and put into the CAP canal for delivery to the Phoenix metropolitan area. Phoenix, by the way, is doing a great job with looking at how do you process the wastewater for surrounding communities, Phoenix and the surrounding communities, figuring out what water they need and what water those other communities then get to keep or get from the CAP canal because they've got their needs met. So there's a lot of things going on. And part of that, of course, is figuring out water efficient agricultural use. And maybe the cities need to pay the agricultural folks to some of the cost of doing that in exchange for being able to keep some of that water. So there are things that we can do. And I think a lot of people are looking at that. So we still need to do a little bit of work, but we'll get there. And by the way, I want to go back to one thing, and that is, we kind of picked on the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Reclamation a little bit. And they have a tough job too, because one of the things that's in the foundation documents for the Colorado Compact is that they will maintain a storage reservoir of 20 million acre feet of water. Well, that's really about a third of what the whole system is. A third of anything is not healthy. So yeah, we need to work on making sure we get more in there, and we need to work with them. And I think there are things that the upper basin states do. I like the upper basin states, the way they divide water percentage-wise, and we do it by acre feet. I think we need to kind of revisit some of those things.
Which very quickly takes us back to the whole conversation about reaching out to our colleagues in the upper and lower basin and actually seeing their operation and having them come down here in the winter, which I don't think any of them are going to complain about coming to Arizona in the wintertime. So that there is
You mentioned that.
Yeah, yeah. So that
Works
there's
for the tourism board now.
a hands-on opportunity for what we've seen, what they can see. It is a different environment than the years that we spent on Capitol Hill as a state trying to get the authorization appropriation to get the project built. We're all in it together, basically. And having those conversations throughout the upper and lower basin, I think, have been very productive so far. And I can't imagine anything but more productivity.
The second on Lisa's strategy, which is a strategy to bring those people that live in cold winter areas down here in the wintertime and try to persuade them of the beauty of our cause. We're definitely going to try to implement that more aggressively this year. I think that's a great opportunity to talk reason to people who so far have not seen any.
So one other detail real quick to continue to answer your question. We also need to be able to catch the water that we can when it falls. And was it 2 or 3 years ago, we had some really strong rains and ended up releasing a lot of water down the Salt River. And now there's a plan to put a pathway from the Salt River system to the CAP River system so that we can capture more of that water.
Yeah. Well, you guys, I could talk about water. You know me, I could talk about water for about 5 hours, but we've already hit our time. There's so much more we could talk about, but we'll leave it at that. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I am very excited that you were here and listened. I hope you learned a lot. I know I certainly did. And if you want additional analysis, the Arizona Republic will be delving into this race and many others in coming weeks at opinions.azcentral.com. Also remember, early ballots are going out this week. If you get one, be sure to mail it by October 29th. Or you can vote in person on November 5th. So whatever you do, just be sure to vote. It's so important to make your voice heard on water and a lot of other issues. So thanks for coming again, and good night.
Thank you.